I've always believed photography is about capturing the unseen, the subtle emotions in a face, the unnoticed details in the background, the fleeting moment that holds a story. At least, that's what I used to tell myself before I started freelancing. Most days now, photography was about scraping by, taking whatever gig paid the bills, and hoping the next client wouldn't try to haggle me down to exposure bucks. So when I got a call to photograph a traveling circus in some small Midwest town, I didn't think twice about saying yes. The pay was decent, and the assignment sounded more exciting than weddings or corporate headshots. Besides, circuses had always fascinated me. The bright lights, the whimsical music, the performers defying gravity. There was something intoxicating about their ability to whisk you away from reality, even if just for a night. The circus was set up in a large field just outside town. The moment I stepped onto the grounds, I felt like I'd entered another world. Strings of yellow lights crisscrossed above the midway, casting a warm glow over the crowds below. The air smelled of popcorn, hay, and engine oil from the generators. Children squealed with delight at the games while adults lingered near the food stalls, sipping lemonade or clutching hot dogs wrapped in paper. But what really caught my eye was the main tent, its red and white stripes standing out against the darkening sky. A sign above the entrance read, "The greatest show you'll never forget," in bold, hand-painted letters. I felt a shiver as I passed beneath it. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. The bleachers were packed, and the spotlight followed acrobats flipping through the air, their sequined costumes sparkling. Animals paraded around the ring, handlers keeping a close watch. And then there was Mr. Smiles. He made his entrance with a thunderous burst of applause, cartwheeling into the ring with a bright, exaggerated grin painted on his face. His costume was a patchwork of vivid colors, and his makeup was pristine. A white base with a red nose, oversized eyebrows, and that impossibly wide smile. But what set him apart was his presence. He wasn't just entertaining the audience, he commanded them. His movements were larger than life, every gesture calculated to draw laughter. Yet, beneath the charm, there was an edge to him, a sharpness that made it impossible to look away. My camera was glued to my face. I shot frame after frame, trying to capture the strange magnetism of the man. His antics were hilarious, but there was something about the way he lingered on certain people in the audience, locking eyes a second too long, that unsettled me. I chalked it up to nerves and kept snapping. After the show, I wandered the grounds, my camera slung around my neck, reviewing the shots I'd taken. The circus performers mingled with the crowd, selling souvenirs and posing for photos. I spotted Mr. Smiles leaning against the side of a trailer, wiping off his makeup with a rag. This was my chance. "Hey, Mr. Smiles," I called, raising my camera slightly. "Do you mind if I take a few shots?" He looked up, his grin, painted or otherwise, still firmly in place. "Only if you promise to make me look good," he said, his voice warm but tinged with something that felt off. I snapped a few pictures as we chatted. He was surprisingly articulate, talking about how he loved bringing joy to people, how laughter was the best medicine. But as the conversation continued, his tone shifted. "You ever think about what makes people laugh?" he asked, leaning in slightly. "It's all fear, you know. The absurdity of existence. Death is funny if you think about it long enough." I laughed awkwardly, unsure how to respond. He smiled wider. "Oh, come on, don't tell me you haven't thought about it. People laugh because they're afraid to cry. But me? I make them laugh so hard they forget their fear. For a little while anyway." I didn't know what to say. His words hung in the air, unsettling and oddly profound. When I tried to steer the conversation back to lighter topics, he grew cagey, dodging questions about his background or how long he'd been with the circus. "Long enough," was all he'd say, his tone clipped. The next day, I spent hours editing the photos. Most of them were standard fare: acrobats mid-flip, children on the carousel, close-ups of the ringmaster. But when I zoomed in on a shot of Mr. Smiles, my stomach dropped. It was a black and white portrait I'd snapped during our conversation, but something about it was wrong. His makeup looked heavier, older, and there was a strange vintage quality to the photo. It reminded me of 1940s circus posters I'd seen in museums. Curious, I dug deeper into my shots. I found another photo of him performing, this one clearer. In the background, just faintly, was a poster on the wall of the main tent. A poster advertising Mr. Smiles. Except the date printed on it was 1953. I stared at the screen, my chest tightening. It had to be some kind of mistake, an illusion of the angle or the lighting. But the more I looked, the more certain I became. It was him. Same grin, same painted eyebrows, same unsettling presence. I tried to convince myself it was a joke, part of the circus's shtick. But as I lay awake that night, the image of his face lingered in my mind, his grin stretching wider and wider in the darkness. The photograph haunted me. It wasn't just the impossibility of the date or the eerie familiarity of Mr. Smiles. It was the realization that I had no logical explanation. Every time I tried to rationalize it, I ended up staring at that image for hours, my stomach churning as his painted grin seemed to grow wider. I told myself to drop it. He was just another eccentric performer with an elaborate backstory. But the longer I stayed at the circus, the harder it was to ignore the cracks in the cheerful facade. Something was wrong, and Mr. Smiles seemed to be at the center of it. I started asking questions, casual at first. During breaks, I chatted with performers, snapping photos as I worked. I'd slip in a comment about Mr. Smiles and wait for their reactions. Most shrugged it off or gave vague answers. "He's been with us a while," said one acrobat, her voice low as she tied her ribbons. "Good performer, draws a crowd." "How long is a while?" I asked. She paused, frowning slightly. "A couple of years, I think. Maybe longer." But others had a different take. A young stagehand told me, "I've been here 5 years, and he showed up right after I started. But, nobody remembers him joining. One day, he was just here. Just here." I pressed. "Yeah, weird, right? The guy doesn't talk much about his past, but he's good at what he does. Makes the crowd happy. That's all that matters." The more I dug, the less sense it made. There were no records of him online, no social media, no interviews, no background. The circus's website listed its performers, but Mr. Smiles wasn't on it. Even when I tried searching for the circus's history, the results were strangely sparse, as if the place itself didn't want to be known. Then there was Riley. Riley was a fire juggler barely out of his teens. He and Mr. Smiles seemed to have a bond, often seen chatting or practicing together. Riley was always in the crowd during Mr. Smiles' performances, laughing harder than anyone else. I approached him during a break, asking how long he'd known the clown. "Smiles? He's like a mentor," Riley said, grinning as he twirled an unlit torch. "Helps me work on my routines, Says laughter and fire have a lot in common. They're both about control and timing." "What's he like off stage?" I asked. Riley hesitated, his grin faltering. "Different. Quiet. But I don't know, there's something about him, like he sees through people." A week later, Riley vanished. The official story was simple. Riley had left to pursue bigger opportunities. But no one could tell me where he'd gone or how he'd left so abruptly. His trailer was empty by the next morning, his possessions gone as if he'd never existed. The performers I asked about him grew uncomfortable, brushing off my questions. Only the stagehand muttered under his breath, "That's just how it is sometimes." The night after Riley disappeared, I made my decision. If no one would tell me the truth, I'd find it myself. Mr. Smiles' trailer was on the far edge of the grounds, half hidden by a line of trees. It was an old thing, its faded paint and peeling decals in stark contrast to the clown's vibrant persona. I waited until the evening show was in full swing. The crowd's laughter echoed across the grounds, drowning out my footsteps as I approached the trailer. The door was locked, but the window wasn't. Hoisting myself up, I slipped inside, landing silently on the worn carpet. The air was thick with the smell of grease paint and something else, something metallic and sharp. The interior was cramped, lit by a single dim bulb. A small bed, a desk cluttered with makeup containers, and a wardrobe filled the space. But what caught my attention was the wall above the desk. It was covered in photographs. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat. The photos were old, some faded, others yellowed at the edges. Each one showed Mr. Smiles, his makeup always perfect, standing beside different people. But the expressions on their faces weren't joyful. They were terrified, One photo showed a young woman clutching a bouquet, her eyes wide with fear. Another showed a man sitting stiffly on a chair, sweat dripping down his face. The backgrounds varied: a fairground, a wooded clearing, a darkened room. But Mr. Smiles was always the same, his grin unwavering. My hands trembled as I scanned the wall. At the bottom, tucked behind a stack of papers, I found a map. It was hand-drawn, with XS marking locations across the Midwest. Scribbled notes beside the marks read things like, "Good crowd and plenty of space." Suddenly, I heard footsteps outside. My heart pounded as I stuffed the map into my pocket and scanned the room for an escape. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by a familiar humming, the circus tune Mr. Smiles always played during his act. I slipped back through the window just as the trailer door creaked open. Hitting the ground, I darted into the shadows of the trees, holding my breath as the humming stopped abruptly. I could feel his eyes scanning the darkness, but I didn't dare look back. The next morning, I woke to a knock at my motel door. Groggy and still shaken, I opened it to find Mr. Smiles standing there, holding my camera. "You dropped this," he said, his grin as wide as ever. "Thought you might need it." I stared at him, speechless, as he handed it to me. "Thanks," I managed to mumble. He tipped an imaginary hat. "Careful where you point that thing," he said with a wink. "Sometimes you capture things better left unseen." He turned and walked away, whistling the circus tune. My hands shook as I powered on the camera. The memory card was gone. The map had haunted me since the moment I saw it. Those crude XS scattered across the Midwest weren't random. They marked places where the circus had stopped, places where Mr. Smiles had performed, places where people had vanished, and the largest, darkest X sat just an hour outside town. I told myself it was a fool's errand to follow it. I had no plan, no backup, just a burning need for answers. But the longer I stared at that map, the clearer it became. I had to know. The farmhouse was a relic of another time, slouching against the horizon as if the weight of its past had broken its back. The windows were shattered, and the door hung crooked on rusted hinges. Vines clawed up the faded wood, almost swallowing it whole. It looked like the kind of place where bad things happened. I parked a safe distance away, my car hidden behind a row of overgrown bushes. The silence out here was oppressive, the kind that made your ears strain for the faintest sound. I gripped my flashlight tightly and stepped inside. The smell hit me first, a mix of mold, rot, and something coppery. Blood. My stomach churned, but I pushed forward. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight, their protests loud enough to make me wince. The dim beam of my flashlight danced over graffiti-covered walls and broken furniture. The first room was empty, save for a few rusted farm tools scattered in the corners. It wasn't until I entered the second room that I realized why Mr. Smiles had marked this place. Mannequins, at least a dozen of them, their pale, dismembered limbs arranged in grotesque tableaus. One sat slumped in a chair, its head tilted unnaturally, a red slash painted across its throat. Another was sprawled on the floor, its arms splayed wide, the hands replaced with gardening shears. The worst was the one in the corner, bound to a makeshift wooden cross, its hollow eyes staring at me accusingly. The paint wasn't just paint. It smelled wrong, metallic, sticky. I didn't need to touch it to know what it was. I forced myself to look away and focus on the rest of the room. A large chest sat against the far wall, its lid slightly ajar. My hands shook as I lifted it open. Photographs, hundreds of them, crammed into the chest like someone had tried to bury the memories. I picked one up, then another and another. Each was worse than the last. In every photo, Mr. Smiles stood front and center, his painted grin as wide and artificial as ever. But the people around him were real, their terror unmistakable. Some were bound, some bleeding, their eyes pleading with the camera. Many were faces I recognized, Riley among them, staring blankly as if resigned to his fate. The dates on the back range from the 1950s to the present, spanning decades. And in every single photo, Mr. Smiles looked exactly the same. The same costume, the same makeup, the same unnatural energy captured in every frame. The photos were aged, some yellowed with time, but his image never wavered. I felt my breath quicken. This was a proof of something monstrous. I shoved as many photos as I could into my bag, trying to ignore the way my hands trembled. My flashlight flickered, and I cursed under my breath. A soft noise froze me in place. Gravel crunching. My heart stopped as I heard the unmistakable hum of an engine outside. A car door slammed, followed by slow, deliberate footsteps. My blood turned to ice as the faint melody of a circus tune reached my ears. Mr. Smiles. I killed the flashlight, plunging the room into darkness. My hands fumbled to close the chest, but the lid slipped from my grasp, slamming shut with a dull thud. I winced and ducked behind one of the grotesque mannequins. The door creaked open, and the melody grew louder. I held my breath, my body pressed against the cold plaster of the wall. "You really should have stayed away," Mr. Smiles said, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "Curiosity's a dangerous thing." I peeked out from behind the mannequin, just barely. His silhouette was framed by the doorway, his hat tilted jauntily to one side. He wasn't looking for me. Not yet. He was scanning the room, his movements slow and deliberate. "I knew you'd come," he said, his tone conversational, almost cheerful. "But I thought you'd wait longer." I shifted, trying to stay hidden, but my foot bumped against one of the mannequins. It toppled with a crash, its dismembered limbs scattering across the floor. The room fell deathly silent. Well, Mr. Smiles said softly. "Looks like the game started early." I didn't wait to see what he'd do. My adrenaline surged, and I bolted for the door. My flashlight fell from my pocket as I ran, clattering to the ground, but I didn't stop to grab it. Behind me, I heard the crunch of his boots on the floorboards and his voice rising in that awful sing-song tone. "Run, little mouse, run. The cat loves a good chase." I woke to the oppressive stink of blood and decay. My wrists ached, chafed raw by the rough ropes binding them to the arms of a wooden chair. My head throbbed, a nauseating reminder of the blow that had knocked me out. The room was dimly lit by a single bulb swinging from the ceiling, casting long, flickering shadows across the grotesque mannequins and stained walls. Mr. Smile sat across from me, cross-legged on an old stool. His grin, painted and yet unsettlingly natural, hadn't faltered since I first opened my eyes. "Ah, you're awake," he said brightly, clapping his gloved hands together. "Good. I hate to waste a performance." My stomach churned, but I forced myself to meet his gaze. "What do you want from me?" My voice came out hoarse, barely more than a whisper. He leaned forward, resting his chin on his fist. "Isn't it obvious? You've seen too much. Snooping in my trailer, poking around my things, that was very rude, you know?" His eyes gleamed, but his tone was oddly jovial, like a teacher chastising a child. "Why do this?" I croaked. "What's the point?" His laughter filled the room, rich and deep, echoing off the peeling walls. "Oh, my dear," he said, wiping a tear from the corner of his eye. "You really don't get it, do you? Well, I suppose I have time for a little story before the curtain falls." He stood, pacing slowly as he spoke. "You see, Mr. Smiles isn't just a clown. He's an idea, a legacy. My family's legacy, to be precise. We've been Smiles for generations, passing the painted grin from one to the next. My father was Mr. Smiles, and his father before him, each of us adding our little touch to the persona." My mind raced, struggling to comprehend his words. "A legacy?" He nodded, his grin widening. "Oh yes. You see, the world loves a clown. We bring joy, laughter, distraction. And while everyone's looking at the clown, they're not looking at the man behind the makeup. It's the perfect disguise." He stopped in front of one of the mannequins, gently adjusting its tilted head. "But why?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Why kill people? Why the circus?" He turned to me, his painted face somehow devoid of humanity. "Because we can. Because the circus is a haven for misfits, for drifters. No one asks questions when someone doesn't show up for their next gig. And the crowds? Always new faces, always moving on. It's a hunting ground on wheels." His eyes gleamed with an almost childlike excitement as he continued. "But it's not just about killing. It's about creating something lasting, The photographs, the memories, their trophies. Proof that we were here, that we mattered. The world forgets so quickly, but Mr. Smiles? He's eternal. I stared at him, ball rising in my throat. He was insane, but his words carried a twisted logic. The circus, the anonymity, the transient nature of the lifestyle, it all fit. It was the perfect cover for a family of killers. You're sick. I spat, the taste of fear sharp on my tongue. His grin faltered for a split second, but it returned with a chilling intensity. Oh, I've heard worse, he said with a shrug. But enough about me. Let's talk about you. You're quite the little snoop, aren't you? Digging through my things, taking my pictures. Did you really think you'd get away with it? He pulled a long, thin blade from his pocket, the metal gleaming in the dim light. Now, normally I'd make this quick, but for you, my curious friend, I think I'll take my time. You've earned a special place in my collection. As he stepped closer, I felt a surge of panic. My hands strained against the ropes, my fingers searching desperately for anything I could use. The edge of the chair arm was rough, splintered, and beneath my hand, I felt the cool, sharp edge of broken glass embedded in the wood. Mr. Smiles knelt before me, his knife dancing in the air as he hummed a circus tune. Any last words? He asked, tilting his head like a curious child. Yeah, I said, forcing a shaky smirk. You talk too much. In one swift motion, I grabbed the shard of glass and slashed at the ropes binding my wrist. The makeshift blade cut into my skin, but it was enough. I lunged forward, driving the shard into his thigh. He let out a guttural scream, staggering back as blood seeped through his striped pants. I didn't wait for him to recover. My hands fumbled with the remaining ropes, tearing myself free. The room blurred as I ran for the door, my heart pounding in my ears. Behind me, Mr. Smiles cursed and howled, his voice dripping with rage. You can't run forever. You'll never escape me. The farmhouse seemed to stretch on forever as I sprinted through its decaying halls. My bag slammed against my back, the stolen Polaroids rustling inside. I didn't look back until I burst into the cool night air. The woods were a blur of shadows and moonlight, the branches clawing at my face as I stumbled through the undergrowth. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get as far from that farmhouse, from him, as possible. Somewhere in the distance, I heard his voice, carried on the wind like a taunt. Run, little mouse, run. I didn't stop running until my legs gave out beneath me, and even then, I crawled, clutching the Polaroids like a lifeline. His laughter echoed in my mind, a sound I knew would haunt me forever. The sheriff's office smelled like burnt coffee and stale cigarettes. I sat across from Detective Keller, my hands trembling as I slid the Polaroids across his desk. The photographs spilled out haphazardly, faces frozen in terror, Mr. Smiles grinning like the devil himself in every frame. You're telling me these are real? Keller asked, leaning back in his chair. His face betrayed nothing, but his tone carried a note of skepticism. Yes, I said, my voice shaking. I took them from the farmhouse. The mannequins, the blood, it's all there. Keller picked up a photo, tilting it toward the light. And you're saying this guy, this clown, has been doing this for decades? He calls himself Mr. Smiles, I said, swallowing hard. It's not just him. It's a whole lineage. The circus is their cover. They target towns, pick their victims, and then vanish. Keller sighed and tapped the edge of the photo against his desk. You realize how this sounds, right? Clown murderers, decades-long conspiracies. If I didn't know better, I'd say you've been watching too many horror movies. It's not a story. I snapped, louder than I intended. Heads turned in the small office, and Keller held up a hand to calm me. All right, he said. Let's say I believe you. I'll send some men out to this farmhouse. We'll take a look. 2 hours later, I stood outside the farmhouse, the flashing red and blue lights of police cruisers bathing the decrepit structure in surreal colors. Officers moved in and out, their faces grim as they searched the property. Detective Keller emerged, his expression unreadable. It's empty, he said. What? I took a step toward him. That's not possible. I was just there. The mannequins, the chest, it's all inside. He shook his head. We've been through the whole place. There's nothing there but dust and cobwebs. No blood, no photos, no signs anyone's been here for years. My heart sank. That's not possible. He was here. I stabbed him. There was blood. Keller held up a hand. Look, I'm not saying you're lying, but there's nothing here to back up your story. If this guy's real, he's long gone. I wanted to scream, but the weight of exhaustion pressed down on me. The farmhouse that had been a nightmare just hours ago was now eerily mundane, stripped of all evidence. Even the faint metallic smell was gone. It was as though the place had wiped itself clean. I'm telling the truth, I whispered, but Keller's eyes told me he didn't believe me. The next few weeks passed in a blur of sleepless nights and restless travel. The circus was gone, packed up and vanished without a trace. I scoured news reports and social media for any mention of it, but there was nothing. It was as if it had never existed. I couldn't go home. The thought of staying in one place made my skin crawl. Instead, I drifted from one cheap motel to another, keeping my head low and my eyes open. Every shadow in the parking lot, every creak of a floorboard sent my heart racing. Paranoia became my constant companion. Then, in a city 3 states away, I saw it. The poster was plastered on a lamppost near a bustling intersection, its bright colors almost mocking in their cheerfulness. The show of a lifetime, it proclaimed in bold, glittering letters. Beneath it was a familiar face, Mr. Smiles, his painted grin wide and inviting. My stomach turned. The circus was here. I ripped the poster down, clutching it in trembling hands as I scanned the crowd around me. People walked by, oblivious, their faces lit with the glow of their phones. I wanted to grab someone, shake them, scream at them to stay away. But I knew what would happen. They'd dismiss me as crazy, just like the police had. Still, I tried. I told the motel clerk, the cashier at the gas station, even a group of kids hanging out by the park. Each time, I was met with confusion, pity, or laughter. No one believed me. The package arrived the next morning. I found it sitting outside my motel room door, wrapped in plain brown paper. No name, no return address. My hands trembled as I brought it inside, locking the door behind me. Inside was a single Polaroid. It showed me tied to the same chair I'd escaped from in the farmhouse, my face pale and streaked with fear. Behind me, Mr. Smiles leaned in close, his grin wider than ever, one gloved hand resting on my shoulder. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible. Then I flipped the photo over, and my blood ran cold. A date was scrawled on the back in red ink. 2 weeks from today. I dropped the photo as if it had burned me, my pulse roaring in my ears. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in. How could this be real? My phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling me out of my spiraling thoughts. It was an unknown number. My shaking fingers hovered over the screen before I answered. Hello? My voice cracked. A familiar laugh echoed through the line, low and sinister. I told you, didn't I? Mr. Smile said, his tone almost affectionate. You'll never escape me. The curtain's not down yet, little mouse. The line went dead. I sank to the floor, the Polaroid staring up at me like a prophecy. Outside, a faint melody drifted through the air, soft, distant, unmistakable. The circus tune. Thanks for watching. If you like the story, click like, subscribe to the channel, and write an idea for the next story in the comments.